by Senator Harder.
Yes, thank you. And thank you to the witnesses. I have a question for both of you. First to Professor Braw. Is it your assessment that the Magnitsky sanctions as applied by the countries that have this tool are in fact currently used as a geopolitical instrument rather than as a way of promoting human rights? And are you then in effect saying that there are double standards at play in the application of Magnitsky sanctions?
That is an excellent question. I don't think the intention of the countries that use Magnitsky sanctions at the moment is to use them as a geopolitical tool. But of course, the intention is not the decisive part. It's the interpretation that's the decisive part. And if countries around the world see Magnitsky sanctions as a geopolitical tool used by powerful Western countries, then the reputation of the Magnitsky sanctions as a human rights tool will suffer dangerously. And I think we are, unfortunately, Senator, we are on the path towards such a situation where a complete lack, almost complete lack of Magnitsky sanctions imposed on Southeast Asia, where the US and Europe don't really have a very strong geopolitical interests. The lack of Magnitsky sanctions there suggests that Magnitsky sanctions are really primarily used against Russia and in some cases China, our main geopolitical adversaries. So that's maybe it's clearly, I think it's unintentional, but it needs to change, because if we are going to hold human rights abuses to account, the same standard has to be applied to all countries. And if I may add, Senator, it also has to be applied to countries that are our friends. And I think this is where it will become really tricky for Western governments, because we have some geopolitical partners and indeed allies that are not particularly respectful of human rights. Well, if we are going to use these sanctions, we're going to have to impose them on those countries as well, individuals in those countries as well, and that could become a real dilemma for Western governments.
Thank you, Dr. Braw. And I would conclude from your comment that the double standard extends well beyond Southeast Asia. For Professor Cardwell, you parenthetically uttered the phrase, setting aside the effectiveness or the efficacy of sanctions, and then you went on to talk about implementation. I'm always asking about the efficacy because that seems to me to be the most important question. Would you comment on efficacy? And I'm talking about
Certainly.
Deterrence rather than punishment.
Certainly. The reason that I said that phrase, Senator, as you quite rightly picked up on, is that it hasn't been the focus of my research, which means that I'm not best placed to comment as to whether the sanctions work, which is, of course, the key questions about sanctions. My interest in this came from what does it tell us about, what do EU sanctions tell us about the EU as a foreign policy actor? That's why I was coming at it from this, and which informs my position there. So I will leave the question of efficacy, although it is so important, to others who are better able to comment. What, of course, I can say from the research and looking at the way in which sanctions put in place by the EU have evolved, and this also relates to Dr. Braw's comments about where they are applied, is that we do see a trend that, yes, the EU found it much more easy to place sanctions on countries, let's say smaller countries in sub-Saharan Africa, than on larger, more economically powerful states. So all of these things, I think, come into the mix in terms of what we expect, and these the lack of uniformity in approach.